Okay, last month I told a funny story. Today I have a sweet but scandalous story about infidelity. It's secondhand, so I'm not in trouble. Secondhand. But it comes from my grandmother. So now I turn to the camera and I tell my father to turn off Facebook and leave it alone for this story. We'll be fine. The last few years of my grandmother's life, she lived to 95, but the last couple of years I would fly into Los Angeles and I would rent a convertible. I couldn't afford to fly to Los Angeles. I couldn't afford a convertible, but I didn't need her to know that. Right? I'd go over to the home where she was basically incapacitated, and they would bring her out to the car and prop her up with pillows. The flowers will come in later. And we would drive the coast. I don't mean just a little. We would drive the coast. Highway 1, up and down, wherever you want to go, Grandma. At this point, she was living off chocolate, and she was 93, and we were having a great time. We'd do it Saturday and Sunday when I visited. Well, she started to tell me stories. Not the same kind of stories I got when I was 4, right? She was in and out of kind of a fugue state. And in that going in and out, she would tell me things you don't usually tell your grandson. And I would just drive and look over and get the story. And one time she says to me, "You know your grandfather had another woman." I said, "Oh, tell me, Grandma. Tell me a little bit about this." She says, "Okay, it's a little bit after the war. So we're talking about the late 40s in Chicago. And she suspects something going on. So imagine it's Chicago, 1940-something, 48, let's say. And she follows my grandfather and this other woman into a bar. Now, my grandfather would have been in a cool-looking suit with a hat. My grandmother would have had a skirt and a nice blouse and a string of pearls. These guys knew how to do it. She follows him in, she finds them, she comes up and she sits down right next to him. And she says, and I'm not going to say his name, "You have to choose, her or me." Now, this is the 40s. Women don't have a ton of options, so this is particularly badass. She's staring him straight in the eye and saying, "You choose." She might have walked before, and I should go on to say that these two had an amazing relationship, and they were kind to each other, but this happened, and he said, "I choose you," and she said, "Okay, I'm going to give you 5 minutes, then you're never going to see each other again, and we're walking out of here." Damn, Grandma. We drive a little more, we stop for some chocolate, and she says, "David, tomorrow I'm going to tell you my story." "Okay, Grandma." Sure. I drop her off, they get her out of the pillows, they take her inside, and here's when I help her get in. Her room, as usual, is set with beautiful flowers. Beautiful flowers. I go home, I'm in a hotel room, and I think about this. I can't sleep too much. I'm really getting kind of, what's going to happen tomorrow? So that I don't know how much I sleep, but I get in the car, and I'm driving, and I'm just waiting. And she says, his name was John. Okay. So I'm driving, my hands tied against the wheel. I'm both excited to hear this and nervous and confused. I don't know what's going on. And she said, "You know my boss?" Well, her boss took her out to lunch one day. She was the executive secretary in an investment firm. The top as you could go for a woman at her stage in the last century. Just an amazing woman. And Mr. DeGroat, I'll say his name, took her out to lunch to meet a war buddy. I assume World War II, not positive. And these three have the best time. So this would have been the 60s. So we've seen Mad Men, right? We're talking 3 martini lunches. They're having a good time. And she hits it off with this man. Hits it off. So they go out to lunch a few more times. And eventually John and her are having lunch, just the two of them. And this is when she turns to me and she says, "Of course, nothing happened." I don't know. I'm going to let you, as the audience and the listeners, decide if nothing happened. I did not ask. She did not offer. But these two cared about each other a lot. And for years and years, they met for lunch and talked on the phone. And whatever else happened, I don't know, until John has a stroke. John is in the hospital, and my grandmother races to his side. He's had a stroke, and he cannot move part of his body, and he is drooling, and he is a proud man, and he says, "You have to go away. We can't see each other again. I can't see anybody like this." So my grandmother protests, and he says, "I mean it. You cannot." So they now meet over telephone for years and years. My grandfather at this point knows about it. There's some man in a hospital, and I'll tell you, my grandmother and my grandfather had a great relationship. They're on the phone, and they're talking, and they care about each other, and she's there for him until eventually he dies. I never heard this story. Another 10 years passes. My grandfather, at 95, he passes away. And he passed away, I think it was like New Year's Eve or right before that. And the next Valentine's Day, a dozen roses show up at her door. And the card says, "Love, John." And she doesn't know what's going on. How could this be? Until Easter comes around and another bouquet of flowers comes. Memories, John. And every major holiday and birthday for the rest of her life, an enormous bouquet of flowers came. Now, my grandmother is a woman of faculty and drive, and this would not be a mystery for long, so she looks into it. She discovers that this man set up a trust, a detective, an attorney, so that as the first holiday after my grandfather passed away, she would receive flowers every single holiday and every day that mattered to her for the rest of her life. Now, I don't know what happened. I don't know the full story. But these two people loved each other in some way, right? And I can tell you that I know my grandmother. I know my grandmother the way you would know a grandmother if you're 4. She took me to Sears, and she bought me popcorn and clothes and toys and told me funny stories. But somebody else knew my grandmother in a whole different way, a way that shaped his life, in a way that was probably the last thing he thought about in his life. And in that car, as I was driving, I thought what it was a blessing to me to know this story and for my grandmother to have him in his life. And I don't care about the details. There's love there, and that meant so much to me. Thank you.